Thanks so much for joining us for CBN News Today. I'm Ephraim Graham. We begin with new confirmation the missing Malaysian airliner kept flying long after its locator signal was turned off. That has authorities expanding their search much further west. Officials say the information suggests the plane was in the air for another 4 to 5 hours after they lost contact. Caitlin Burke reports.
The search zone has expanded yet again in what's quickly becoming the most expensive aviation investigation ever. Still, authorities have few clues about where the Malaysian Airlines plane is or why it vanished.
We haven't found the aircraft with all the resources that are currently searching for the aircraft by the end of a week. Then comes a second question, which is how long may it take us to find the aircraft? That could be an extended period.
The plane's been missing since early last Saturday, and aviation experts say the mounting evidence shows the plane's disappearance was most likely not an accident. Late Thursday night, ABC News quoted two unidentified American officials saying the U.S. believes the plane's two communication systems were shut down separately. That would mean the plane didn't disappear because of some kind of mechanical failure. The possibilities of what did actually happen keep growing, including the chances that a pilot wanted to commit suicide or someone with flying experience wanted to hijack the plane for a later purpose.
New information, an additional search area may be opened in the Indian Ocean.
Authorities say they have several pings from the airline's service data system in the 4 to 5 hours after the last transponder signal. That indicates the plane was still in the air, possibly putting it over the Indian Ocean rather than between Malaysia and Vietnam. A U.S. destroyer is being moved into the Indian Ocean to begin a search in that area. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
New York City firefighters say they're working with hope of still finding survivors from Wednesday's deadly gas explosion in East Harlem. Workers are searching a pile of rubble with sound devices to probe for voices and telescopic cameras to peer into small spaces. At least 8 people are confirmed dead, and we're learning more about 2 of the victims. Griselda Camacho and Carmen Tanco are being remembered as active members of Bethel Gospel Assembly, a church just a few blocks away from that explosion site. New York City ministers are rallying around the church that lost everything in Wednesday's deadly explosion. Spanish Christian Church occupied the first floor of one of the 2 buildings that were leveled. Ministers from across the city began holding round-the-clock prayer vigils on Thursday. They're being led by Pastor William Devlin from the Bronx.
We've all gathered together to support Pastor Thomas Perez. He's an older gentleman in his 70s. The church had been there for 80 years. And they've really been salt and light in the community here in East Harlem. The pastor is very concerned just about the future of the church and what it's going to mean for him and where it's going to go. The immediate need is to pray for them because they're still wondering if there were apartments above the church that some of the congregants and parishioners lived in. So they're still looking for bodies. There's still about 6 people missing. And so what the greatest need right now is just that they would guide and direct the first responders, FDNY, in order to locate any of the missing.
Pastor Thomas Perez says his congregation does plan to rebuild. Initial clues are pointing to a more than century-old cast iron pipeline that supplied gas to the buildings when it comes to the cause of the explosion. The Republican-led House of Representatives have passed a bill that would make it easier for Congress to sue a president for not enforcing federal laws. Conservatives and some liberals have criticized President Obama for simply picking and choosing which laws he decides to support. And they say that amounts to an abuse of presidential powers. Under the bill, the House or Senate would have a fast track against any president who failed to carry out the constitutional duty to enforce the law. I want to turn now to the crisis in Ukraine. Once again, thousands of Russian troops are holding military exercises near the Ukrainian border. At least 10,000 soldiers, along with artillery batteries, tanks, forces, and assault helicopters, are active in the region. Meanwhile, in eastern Ukraine, violent clashes between pro-Russian demonstrators and supporters of the Ukrainian government left at least 1 person dead Thursday. in Donetsk. 17 people were injured after rival groups clashed in the central square. U.S. and European leaders are cautioning Russia not to escalate the situation in Crimea. All of this is happening as the fate of the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea is still unclear. Sunday, voters will decide whether to remain part of Ukraine or to split and join Russia. The West has said it won't recognize the vote, while Russia says it will protect its citizens. Our George Thomas has more now from Ukraine.
From the corridors of Washington,
we have been very firm in saying that we will stand with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people.
To Berlin, Germany.
One thing has to be absolutely clear. The territorial integrity of Ukraine is not up for discussion.
To Kiev, Ukraine.
We fight for our freedom, we fight for our independence, we fight for our sovereignty, and we will never surrender.
Western leaders are warning Russia to change course in Crimea or face consequences.
We call on Russia to cease all preparations for the annexation of Crimea.
But the tough words are having little impact as Russia's grip tightens by the day. Some 20,000 forces have now fanned out across the Crimean Peninsula ahead of Sunday's referendum vote. And this idea of holding a constitutional referendum on whether Crimea should be part of Russia or Ukraine is extremely controversial here on the streets of Kiev. Most folks are dead set against it.
In all likelihood, they will vote to join Russia, but it will be an illegal vote.
There is strength in unity, but this issue is dividing us, and this is not good.
The U.S. has placed visa bans and frozen financial assets of Russian officials responsible for violating Ukraine's sovereignty, and more potential sanctions could be on the way.
It can get ugly fast if the wrong choices are made.
Adding to tensions, Russia is holding another round of military exercises along Ukraine's eastern border, involving thousands of troops. This as Kiev's new government votes to form a 60,000-man military force to boost its country's defenses against a potential full-scale Russian invasion. George Thomas, CBN News.
Security officials in Europe are concerned the Syrian civil war could lead to jihad in their countries. Many Islamic radicals are traveling from Europe to Syria to fight in the war, and some are now coming home. In Germany, authorities arrested a man they believe fought for a hardline Islamic group in Syria. They suspect he was planning an act of violence. Meanwhile, Spanish and Moroccan police arrested 7 suspected members of a cell that allegedly recruited jihadists to fight in Syria as well as other places. Last year, Spanish police arrested 8 suspected jihadist militants in a similar operation. The movie Noah is being banned in much of the Muslim world. Officials in Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar say the movie will not be allowed in theaters because Islam does not allow images of prophets, and it could offend viewers. Other Muslim-majority countries, including Tunisia, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Morocco, said government censors probably won't approve the movie. Paramount Pictures added a disclaimer saying artistic license has been taken after some Christians questioned the film's accuracy. Noah opens this month here in the U.S. Tennessee public schools are one step closer to celebrating Christmas without fear of being sued. The State House approved legislation that protects schools from lawsuits over displaying religious symbols during the holidays. The proposal also allows students and staff to freely say Merry Christmas and other traditional greetings. It also says religious displays should not be limited to one religion, and that messages promoting one faith above others are prohibited. A longtime defender of global religious rights has died at his Illinois home. Reverend Keith Roderick was General Secretary of the Coalition for the Defense of Human Rights. He was a longtime advocate for oppressed religious minorities. Roderick spent much time in recent years lobbying Congress on behalf of suffering Christians in countries like Iraq and Sudan. He was an occasional guest on CBN's Christian World News program. At a Chicago conference in 2012, Roderick urged Christians to speak out for the persecuted church.
To the Christian community of the United States, we who allow the oppression share the crime. And I should add, will be doomed to share in its consequences.
For more on Reverend Roderick, look for Gary Lane's blog, The Global Lane, at cbnnews.com. Coming up, America's ticking time bomb, why some say protecting the power grid needs to be at the forefront of the country's security plan. The U.S. power grid may be vulnerable to widespread sabotage. The Washington Free Beacon reports that concern has been raised by the New Jersey Regional Operations Intelligence Center. That came after recent incidents, including sabotage or potential sabotage at power plants and towers around the country. The concern is that many of the incidents could be a sign of preparation for a larger coordinated attack on the power grid. Meanwhile, a federal study reveals the U.S. could suffer a nationwide blackout if just 9 power substations were sabotaged on a hot summer day. The Wall Street Journal reports that blackout could last weeks, if not months. It would only take coordinated attacks in the country's 3 separate power systems to knock out the entire network. According to people familiar with the study, you can find a link to the Journal's report on our website, cbnnews.com. When Superstorm Sandy struck in 2012, thousands of people lost power for weeks. The storm revealed the electrical systems in many cities are in really bad shape. Some say no quick fix is in sight, and they warn that makes America even more vulnerable to terrorists.
America's largest cities are ticking time bombs. The problem lies in a power grid that's simply too old and can't keep up. Transformers already exceed their intended lifespan, and a growing population puts greater stress on a framework never meant to see the 21st century. New York City's infrastructure is among the oldest in the country, and experts say that if upgrades aren't made a priority, the results will be catastrophic, and not just here in the city, but worldwide. We witnessed how Hurricane Sandy brought the world's financial center and America's largest city to its knees. And experts tell us that multi-billion-dollar disaster pales in comparison to what could happen with a complete meltdown.
When you start having damage to the electrical transmission and distribution system, that's where it's catastrophic. Essentially, it's like a toaster. You start heating up the system to the point where equipment actually becomes damaged.
New York's electricity moves from power plants to transformers at a very high voltage. They transform it to a lower, more usable voltage that's then sent throughout the city. If a transformer or switchyard is taken out, the connection between the power plant and all the local lines is lost. This means no lights, but it also means no water or steam. That happened during Sandy with this explosion at the 14th Street switchyard.
There are hundreds of thousands of people that have no electricity, which in New York, because it's a vertical city, has no water. We've also seen the collapse of failure of the steam system.
The steam plants rely on Con Ed power to be able to operate the plant. Some have generators, but not all. So if they lose the steam plant in the summertime, it is difficult. A lot of customers are in trouble. If they lose it in the wintertime, it's significant because now you have major residential buildings that are all dependent upon steam.
New York's blackout from Sandy lasted for weeks. While much of the city pulled together, frustrations grew in other areas, leading to looting and chaos. Law enforcement officers fear a longer-term scenario.
There is such a thing as right and wrong, and there's such a thing as good and evil, and the evil will come out when the electric goes down. How long can you humanly stay on your feet when you're trying to evacuate a building, trying to evacuate the subway tunnels, trying to get injured to the hospital, and keeping an eye on those people that would take advantage of the ordinary person? Add to that the real threat of terrorists. The terrorists are amongst us. The minute we're preoccupied with getting someone from an elevator, emptying a subway train, all those other things, they will take advantage, and that's what they look for.
This is the Farragut switchyard. The electricity that comes through here powers the financial district and the New York City subway system. But it has minimal security and flimsy gates. And if it's this accessible to us, imagine how accessible it is to terrorists.
As horrible as 9/11 was to this nation and to the city, had the terrorists flown 2 planes into this facility, the consequences to New York City and to the nation would have been orders of magnitude more damaging than what actually happened.
Adam Victor of Transgas Developments took a potential infrastructure solution to city leaders back in 2001. A cogeneration plant able to keep up with 21st century technology.
This plant would be in a position, because of its location, to reinforce the electric grid and the stream grid. We'd be in a place where we could actually electrify the New York City subway tunnels. Our plant would have what's called black start capability, that even if the grid went down, our plant would stay up and running. We also decided to bury the plant, and on top of this plant, we were going to put a park.
Victor's plan would have used private investors to pay for the plant under a public-private partnership, and he says it would have been clean and green.
We would have cleaned up the land, we would have cleaned up the water, we would have cleaned up the air with this facility.
Victor maintains, however, that politics and a lack of local support led to a rejection of his plant in court. He adds that if his cogeneration plant had been in operation, it could have kept the lights on during Hurricane Sandy. So what's the holdup in fixing this aging system? CBN News spoke with former New York Governor George Pataki.
It costs money, and it's always hard for government to find money. It might not be popular, and it certainly never is popular when you have an infrastructure project going near where someone lives or works. But you can't just focus on the issues of today. You also have to think about what the needs are tomorrow. And it's a balancing act, and some people can't do it. Very often, the future needs, the infrastructure needs are what forgotten.
Victor says he will continue to fight with the hope that city and state leaders will get on board before it's too late.
All infrastructure that has ever been built has failed, and it's a matter of time. And older infrastructure, no matter how good, will eventually fail. And the sooner that we augment and reinforce this old infrastructure, the safer we will be to prevent that day of reckoning.
Caitlin Burke, CBN News, New York, New York.
Up next, an Iraqi woman's childhood dreams come true. Watch her become an American citizen next. Iraq was once home to a thriving Christian community, but not any longer. Now Christians are fleeing from the chaos there, and many of them are coming to the United States. John Jessup introduces us to one Iraqi woman who recently became an American citizen.
A woman and Christian president of Iraq? Yeah, give it a couple more centuries.
Asil al-Banna has always been bright and optimistic, but unlike her positive personality, many of her childhood memories were scarred by the dark clouds of war.
I was very determined I needed to get away. I just couldn't see any future for myself.
She and her family fled Baghdad in 1991 to escape what seemed like endless fighting. She was 10 years old when the nearly decade-long Iran-Iraq war started, and 19 when U.S. troops launched Operation Desert Storm. After a month seeking refuge in Jordan, she convinced her dad to take her to a country she'd always dreamed of visiting.
I begged my father. I said, Dad, please, let's just go to the American embassy. Let's just try. It was like a dream to me, liberty and freedom of expression. I didn't grow up with that, so I really wanted it.
She and her father had round-trip tickets to visit relatives in Kentucky. But her aunt had other plans for Asil, and they didn't include returning to the dictatorial rule of Saddam Hussein.
She told my father, this girl I will never ever let her leave back with you. My father was like, what are you talking about? She's my daughter.
Asil's aunt helped her get into the University of Kentucky's architecture program. She graduated, started working in design, and has flourished in the U.S. ever since, feeling more American as time went by.
Being Iraqi, it's who I am, who I've been. Being American, on the other hand, is who I became, who I grew into.
And recently, on the 222nd anniversary of the U.S. Bill of Rights, she took the oath and became an American citizen. Surrounded by our founding documents at the National Archives in Washington, D.C.
This country is wonderful in opening its doors to immigrants. And very often you come and you rush through the process. For me, it was more of a growing experience. And so today it was more like I'm sealing the deal.
She still cares deeply for her native Iraq and its people, but her hopes have dimmed on an issue that hits close to home, the growing persecution of Christians in the Middle East.
Honestly, I don't see a future. I think it doesn't look good.
Asil is an Iraqi Christian, home to one of the world's oldest Christian populations.
It's considered a very honest and fair community, and they gave a lot to Iraq, to the country.
But after the Iraq War began, Christians became an easy target, frequently persecuted, tortured, or killed. In the last 10 years, of the more than 1 million Christians who once called Iraq home, only about a third are left, with more fleeing daily.
There's just no doubt that ancient and historic Christian communities are threatened as never before.
The situation is essentially the same in Syria and in Egypt, where civil unrest is making it nearly impossible for once ancient Christian communities to survive. As a new American citizen, Asil has high hopes for the country she now calls home and plans to take full advantage of the rights and freedoms she never knew in Iraq, like voting. This spring, she intends to cast her very first ballot for a fellow Iraqi who's running for office in Washington, D.C., a scenario she understands is unique to the American experience.
This doesn't happen in many countries, but it definitely happens in the United States. It just gave me this hope, like you can do anything you want. You can be anyone you want to be. And that's what's so beautiful about this country.
John Jessup, CBN News, Washington.
And finally today, here's a question for coffee lovers. How much are you willing to pay for that daily fix of caffeine? Boudin, a new specialty coffee shop in New York, has a $10 latte on their menu.
Coffee beans better be made of gold for $10.
I think it should better keep me up for 48 hours nonstop.
The owners say the $10 latte uses rare and expensive Ethiopian beans along with special syrup and licorice powder, which is what drives up the price. And while some customers admit to splurging every once in a while, for the most part, they stick to the lower priced coffee, which starts at just $2.50. Guess it's worth one try. That is going to do it now for CBN News Today. You can find more of our exclusive coverage of the issues you care most about at cbnnews.com. Have a fabulous Friday and a wonderful weekend.